Chapter 1 presents the main problematic of the book: the challenge and necessity of adequately theorizing the relationship between discursive practices and the material world. I begin with a discussion of representationalism, the idea that representations and the objects, subjects, events, or states of affairs they purport to represent are independent from one another. I discuss some of the problems, difficulties, and limitations of representationalism. I then consider a class of alternative approaches to representationalism that can collectively be designated as performative. Performative approaches call into question the basic premises of representationalism and focus inquiry on the practices of performances of representing, as well as on the productive effects of those practices and the conditions for their efficacy. In recent years, both science studies scholars and critical social theorists have pursued performative alternative to social constructivist approaches, which, in much like their scientific realist counterparts, are based on representationalist beliefs. The move towards performative alternatives to representationalism changes the focus from questions of correspondence between descriptions and reality, do they mirror nature or culture, to matters of practices or doings or actions. By and large, performative accounts offered by science studies scholars on the one hand and social and political theorists on the other have led parallel lives with surprisingly little exchange between them. I point out that some of the strengths and weaknesses of these different performative approaches and, in Chapter 4, put them in conversation with one another in an effort to sharpen both sets of tools, or rather to develop a performative account that takes both sets of insights seriously. Chapter 2 serves to seemingly disparate purposes. It introduces the important physical phenomenon of diffraction, and it discusses questions of methodology. I will explain what these issues have to do with each other shortly, but first I want to offer a brief description of the physical phenomenon of diffraction. Diffraction is a phenomenon that is unique to wave behavior. Water waves exhibit diffraction patterns, as do sound waves and light waves. Diffraction has to do with the way waves combine when they overlap, and the apparent bending and spreading out of waves when they encounter an obstruction. Diffraction phenomena are familiar from everyday experience. A familiar example is the diffraction or interference patterns that water makes when they rush through an opening in a breakwater, or when stones are dropped in a pond and the ripples overlap. While some physicists continue to abide by the purely historical distinction between diffraction and interference phenomena, I use the term diffraction and interference interchangeably. That is, I side with the physicist Richard Feynman and others who drop this distinction on the basis that what is at issue in both cases is the physics of the superposition of waves. As I explain in Chapter 2, diffraction is an apt overarching trope for this book. Diffraction plays a crucial role in sorting out some key issues in quantum physics. Perhaps one of the most well-known dilemmas in quantum physics is the wave-particle duality paradox. Experimental evidence at the beginning of the 20th century exhibited seemingly contradictory features. On the one hand, light seemed to behave like a wave, but under different experimental circumstances, light seemed to behave like a particle. Given these results, what can we conclude about the nature of light? Is it a particle or a wave? Remarkably, it turns out that similar results are found for matter. Under one set of circumstances, electrons behave like particles, and under another, they behave like waves. Hence, what lies at the heart of the paradox is the very nature of nature. As the book progresses, I develop deeper and deeper insights about this profound set of issues, and diffraction phenomena play a key role all along in helping to illuminate the nature of nature. Furthermore, as I explain in Chapter 2, Diffraction turns out to be an apt material and semiotic figuration for the methodological approach that I use and develop. There is a long history of using vision and optical metaphors to talk and theorize about knowledge. The physical phenomenon of reflection is a common metaphor for thinking. A little reflection shows this to be the case. Donna Haraway proposes diffraction as an alternative to the well-worn metaphor of reflection. As Haraway suggests, diffraction can serve as a useful counterpoint to reflection. Both are optical phenomena, but whereas reflection is about mirroring and sameness, diffraction attends to patterns of difference. One of her concerns is the way reflexivity has played itself out as a methodology, especially as it has been taken up and discussed by mainstream scholars in science studies. Haraway notes that reflexivity or reflection invites the illusion of essential, fixed position, while diffraction strains us to more subtle vision. Diffraction entails the processing of small but consequential differences, and the processing of differences is about ways of life. In this book, I further develop and elaborate these ideas, drawing on quantum understandings of diffraction phenomena and the result of some recent experiments. Ultimately, I argue that a diffractive methodology is respectful of the entanglement of ideas and other materials in ways that reflexive methodologies are not. In particular, what is needed is a method attuned to the entanglement of apparatuses of production, one that enables genealogical analyses of how boundaries are produced, rather than presuming sets of well-worn binaries in advance. I begin this elaboration in Chapter 2 with the full display of its intricate patterns and reverberations with all the vibrancy, richness, and vitality of this remarkable physical phenomenon is manifest only in diffracting these insights through the grading of the entire set of book chapters. One important aspect that I wish to discuss is that diffraction does not fix what is the object and what is the subject in advance. And so, unlike methods of reading one text or set of ideas against another, where one set serves as a fixed frame of reference, diffraction involves reading insights through one another in ways that help illuminate differences as they emerge. How different differences get made, what gets excluded, and how those exclusions matter. For example, as I suggested earlier, if the goal is to think of the social and the natural together, to take account of how both factors matter, not simply to recognize that they both matter, then we need a method for theorizing the relationship between the natural and the social together without defining one against the other or holding either nature or culture as the fixed referent for understanding the other. What is needed is a diffraction apparatus to study those entanglements. One way to begin to build the needed apparatus is to use the following approach: to rethink the nature of nature based on our best scientific theories, while rethinking the nature of scientific practices in terms of our best understanding of the nature of nature and our best social theories, while rethinking our best social theories in terms of our best understanding of the nature of nature and the nature of scientific theories. A diffractive methodology provides a way of attending to entanglement in reading important insights and approaches through one another. In Chapter 3, I offer a unique interpretation of Bohr's philosophy physics. Interpretations of Bohr's epistemological framework have been widely divergent. Bohr has been fashioned a positivist, an idealist, an instrumentalist, a macro-phenomenalist, an operationalist, a pragmatist, a neo-Kantian, and a scientific realist by various mainstream historians and philosophers of science. In contrast, I argue that Bohr's philosophy does not fit neatly into any of these categories because it questions many of the dualisms on which these philosophical schools of thoughts are founded. For example, while Bohr's understanding of quantum physics leads him to reject the possibility that scientists can gain access to the things in themselves, that is, the objects of investigation as they exist outside the human conceptual frameworks, he does not subscribe to a Kantian noumena-phenomena distinction. And while Bohr's practices of physics shows that he holds a realist attitude towards his subject matter, he is not a realist in any conventional sense, since he believes that the interaction between objects of investigation and what he calls the agencies of observation is not determinable and therefore cannot be subtracted out, to leave a representation of the world as it exists independently of human beings. Significantly, Bohr's epistemological framework based on empirical findings in the atomic domain in the early 20th century offers a new understanding of fundamental philosophical issues such as the relationship between knower and known, the role of measurement, questions of meaning, making and concept use, the conditions for the possibility of objective description, correct identification of the objective referent for measured properties, the nature of causality, and the nature of reality. Bohr's philosophy physics contains important and far-reaching ontological implications, but unfortunately, he stays singularly focused on the epistemological issues and does not make this contribution explicit or explicate his views on the nature of reality. He is explicit in stating that in his opinion, quantum physics shows that the world surely does not abide by the ontology of Newtonian physics. One of the goals of this chapter is to extract the implicit ontological implications and explicate a consistent Bohrian ontology. Ontology, as much as epistemology, plays a crucial role in my agential realist elaboration of Bohr's philosophy physics. See Chapter 4. In Chapter 3, I suggest that there is an important sense in which Bohr's framework can be understood as offering a proto-performative account of scientific practices, including an account of the production of bodies and meanings. I develop this suggestion further in Chapter 4 and further elaborate the performative dimensions of Bohr's account. In what sense is Bohr's account proto-performative? First of all, Bohr's careful analysis of measurement leads him to reject representationalism. Remarkably, Bohr calls into question representationalism's taken for granted stance towards both words and things. That is, unlike some of the post-structuralist and science studies accounts, which fully explicate and emphasize either the discursive or material nature of practices, Bohr takes hold of both dimensions at once. It is not unreasonable, although surely not expected, for a physicist to question accepted ideas concerning the nature of things, but Bohr also concerns himself with the nature of words, including questions of the nature of meaning, practices for making meaning, the conditions for the possibility of intelligibility, and the co-constitution of excluded domain, a domain of unintelligibility. And this is a highly unusual line of questioning for a physicist. But even more remarkably, Bohr understands these issues concerning word and world to be inextricably linked. According to Bohr, our ability to understand the physical world hinges on our recognizing that our knowledge-making practices, including the use and testing of scientific concepts, are material enactments that contribute to and are part of the phenomena we describe. The details of Bohr's nuanced interrogation of the representationalist tenets embedded in Newtonian physics and concording epistemologies are crucial. Therefore, I do not skimp on the details of the physics issues involved, but I also do not assume that the reader has any background in physics. I have made every effort to make these ideas accessible even to readers who have no knowledge of physics. Bohr set the same standards for himself. He firmly believed that it was important to explain things using extensions of everyday concepts. This was as much a methodological and epistemological commitment on Bohr's part as it was about accessibility. Too many important questions lay hidden in the mathematics, and it is crucial not simply to be able to calculate, but to understand what the physics is saying, what it means. It is also vital that I attend to the details of Bohr's philosophy physics, because in Chapter 7, I turn my attention back to the physics and consider some of the foundational issues that continue to plague quantum physics. Only by attending to the rigorous details can we hear nature speak with any kind of clarity. As Einstein said, God is in the details. Chapter 4 is the core chapter of the book. Here I develop my central theoretical framework, Agential realism. Agential realism is an epistemological, ontological, and ethical framework that makes explicit that integral nature of these concerns. This framework provides a post-humanist performative account of technoscientific and other natural cultural practices. By post-humanist, I mean to signal the crucial recognition that non-humans play an important role in natural cultural practices, including everyday social practices, scientific practices, and practices that do not include humans. But also, beyond this, my use of post-humanism marks a refusal to take the distinction between human and non-human for granted, and to found the analyses on the presumably fixed and inherent set of categories. Any such hardwiring precludes a genealogical investigation into the practices through which humans and non-humans are delineated and differentially constituted. A post-humanist performative account worth its salt must also avoid cementing the nature-culture dichotomy into its foundations, thereby enabling a genealogical analysis of these crucial distinctions are materially and discursively produced. A core section of the chapter explicates my proposed agential realist ontology. As I mentioned previously, Bohr keeps his focus on the epistemological issues throughout, and unfortunately never spells out his ontological commitments or the ontological dimensions of his account. On the basis of the Bohrian ontology that I propose in Chapter 3, as well as new experimental evidence discussed in Chapter 7, and other considerations, I propose an agential realist elaboration in Chapter 4. As I argue in Chapter 3, the primary ontological unit is not independent objects with independently determinate boundaries and properties, but rather what Bohr terms phenomena. In my agential realist elaboration, phenomena does not merely mark the epistemological inseparability of observer and observed, or the results of measurements. Rather, phenomena are the ontological inseparability of agentially interacting components. The notion of interactions figures centrally here, see hereafter. Significantly, phenomena are not merely laboratory creations, but basic units of reality. The shift from a metaphysics of things to phenomena makes an enormous difference in understanding the nature of science and ontological, epistemological, and ethical issues more generally. The notion of interaction is a key element of my agential realist framework. The neologism interaction signifies the mutual constitution of entangled agencies. That is, in contrast to the usual interaction, which assumes that there are separate individual agencies that precede their interaction, the notion of interaction recognizes that distinct agencies do not precede, but rather emerge through their interaction. It is important to note that the distinct agencies are only distinct in a relational, not an absolute sense. That is, agencies are only distinct in relation to their mutual entanglement. They don't exist as individual elements. Crucially, as I explain in Chapter 4, the notion of interaction constitutes a radical reworking of the traditional notion of causality. I can't emphasize this point enough. A lively new ontology emerges. The world's radical aliveness comes to light in an entirely non-traditional way that reworks the nature of both relationality and aliveness, vitality, dynamism, agency. This shift of ontology also entails a reconceptualization of other core philosophical concepts such as space, time, matter, dynamics, agency, structure, subjectivity, objectivity, knowing, intentionality, discursivity, performativity, entanglement, and ethical engagement. Performative accounts that social and political theorists have affirmed focus on the productive nature of social practices in human bodies. By contrast, agential realism takes account of the fact that the forces at work in the materialization of bodies are not only social, and the bodies produced are not all human. Crucially, I argue that agential realism clarifies the nature of the causal relationship between discursive practices and material phenomena. That is, I propose a new understanding of how discursive practices are related to the material world. This is a significant result with far-reaching consequences for grasping and attending to the political possibilities for change, the responsible practice of science, and the responsible education of scientists, among other important shifts. These proposed refigurations are explored by considering concrete examples. The third part of the book, Entanglements and Reconfigurations, continues the elaboration of key agential realist ideas introduced in Chapter 4, and works through several different case studies. Here, I demonstrate the usefulness of an agential realist approach for negotiating difficulties in some of the fields that I draw on, such as feminist theory, post-structuralist theory, physics and science, and technology studies. I also show that agential realism makes visible a range of different connections between these disparate fields that have not previously been explored. In Chapter 5, I consider one of the ways in which agential realism can be useful for thinking about specific issues that have been central to feminist theory, activism, and politics. The development of new reproductive technologies, including new visualizing technologies, continues to play a crucial role in the public discourse as well as in feminist theories of the body. Using the example of new reproductive technologies, I explore the significance of my posthumanist performative understanding of the materialization of bodies by explicitly considering its ability to take account of crucial material dimensions, such as material agency, material constraints, and material exclusions that other accounts, including other performative accounts, neglect. In particular, I further examine the implications of my sympathetic but critical reading of Butler's theory of performativity, begun in Chapter 4. Judith Butler's provocative theory of performativity, which links gender performativity to the materialization of sexed bodies, has received widespread attention in academic circles, especially among feminists and queer theory scholars. I argue that Butler's conception of materiality is limited by its exclusive focus on human bodies and social factors, which works against her efforts to understand the relationship between materiality and discursivity in their indissociability. I show how agential realism's reconceptualization of the nature of matter and discursive practices provides a means for taking account of the productive nature of natural as well as cultural forces in the differential materialization of non-human as well as human bodies. It thereby avoids the privileging of discursive over material concerns and the reinscription of the nature-culture dualism that Butler's account inadvertently enacts. Crucially, it also corrects Butler's underestimation of the possibilities for agentially reconfiguring who or what comes to matter, and makes evident a much larger space of possibilities for change. Chapter 5 is a revised version of a previously published work. The original structure has been maintained so that it is available in the form of an autonomous text suitable for classroom use or other forums for discussion. In Chapter 6, I consider how agential realism can contribute to a new materialist understanding of power and its effects on the production of bodies, identities, and subjectivities. This chapter specifically engages Leila Fernandez's ethnographic study of relations of production at a Calcutta jute mill, where questions of political economy and cultural identity are both a work on the shop floor. Central to my analysis is the agential realist understanding of matter as a dynamic and lifting entanglement of relations, rather than a property of things. Drawing on specific developments in political theory, cultural geography, political economy, critical race theory, post-colonial theory, and feminist theory, I consider the dynamic and contingent materialization of space, time, and bodies. The incorporation of material discursive factors, including gender, race, sexuality, religion, and nationality, as well as class, but also technoscientific and natural factors in processes of materialization, the iterative rematerialization of the relations of production, and the agential possibilities and responsibilities for reconfiguring the material, social relations of the world. After developing the ontological and epistemological framework of agential realism, I return in Chapter 7 to the field of physics. I begin this chapter with a review of some of the unresolved interpretational difficulties that have plagued quantum mechanics since its founding 3/4 of a century ago. During the past decade, technological progress in experimental physics has opened up an entirely new empirical domain, the world of experimental metaphysics. That is, questions previously thought to be a matter solely for philosophical debate have been brought into the orbit of empirical inquiry. This is a striking development because it allows scientists to explore metaphysical issues in the laboratory. So much for the category metaphysical. I include in this chapter a review of key experimental findings that have important implications for understanding quantum physics. I also consider the possibility of using agential realism as the basis for a new interpretation, examine its potential for resolving certain long-standing paradoxes in the field, and comparing to some of the new interpretations that have recently been proposed. Significantly, then, my project departs from mainstream and feminist science studies in that it does not merely offer insights about the nature of scientific practices, but also makes a constructive contribution to the field of science being studied. That is, my project is not merely a reflection on science, but takes these insights about scientific practices and about nature, the two key ingredients in Bohr's interpretation, and diffracts them back onto the science itself, thereby making a specific scientific contribution to an active scientific research field, i.e., the foundations of quantum physics. In particular, I argue that the conceptual shifts derived from my diffractive methodology not only reconfigure our understanding of the nature of scientific and other material discursive practices, but also are significant and robust enough to actually form the basis for a new interpretation of quantum physics. Importantly, the metaphysical questions that the new experiments address have wide-ranging implications beyond the domain of physics. The implications will surely be of interest to philosophers, especially those with naturalist inclinations. And despite a growing distaste for metaphysics, post-structuralists and other critical theories will no doubt find much food for thought in the discussion of experiments that directly address questions of the nature of identity, time, and matter. As before, I try to make this chapter accessible to readers who have no background in physics. Physicists will also find much to ponder in this chapter, which includes a systematic review and philosophical exposition of key interpretative issues. The concluding chapter, Chapter 8, brings together major themes in the book and explicates some of the key issues. Concrete examples of nanotechnologies, information technologies, and biotechnologies provides an opportunity for fleshing out these ideas and for analyzing some of the important genealogical elements of the apparatus contemporary physics uses to study entanglements. These technologies are inextricably intertwined, as are the issues they bring into focus. The intraactivity of becoming, the ontology of knowing, and the ethics of mattering. The entanglement of ontology, epistemology, and ethics is emphasized in this chapter. As the book unfolds, the complexity and richness of the phenomenon of diffraction becomes increasingly evident. In this chapter, I bring into focus the overall pattern that has been created, i.e., a diffraction pattern of diffraction as a changing phenomenon, and explain how the pattern itself is a matter of entanglement. Indeed, I argue that diffraction is not merely about differences, and certainly not differences in an absolute sense, but about the entangled nature of differences that matter. Significantly, differences is tied up with responsibility, as I explain in a final section of the chapter. In this last chapter, I develop the basic elements of an agential realist understanding of ethics. I explain that ethical concerns are not simply supplemental to the practices of science, but an integral part of it. But more than this, I show how values are integral to the nature of knowing and being. Objectivity is simultaneously an epistemological ontological, and axiological issue, and questions of responsibility and accountability lie at the core of scientific practices. The correct identification of the objective referent of scientific practices of theorizing and experimenting requires an accounting of the ethical as well as epistemological and ontological concerns. It is not possible to extricate oneself from ethical concerns and correctly discern what science tells us about the world. Realism, then, is not about representations of an independent reality, but about the real consequences, interventions, creative possibilities, and responsibilities of interacting within and as part of the world. It is perhaps worth noting at this juncture that we have come a long way from Freyne's proposal. It seems unlikely that even careful analogical reasoning would have led us into this conclusion about the nature of the relationship between science and ethics. Since this book is lengthier than is fashionable these days, I offer some suggestions for different possible paths through the book for different readers. A word of caution before I do. As I have indicated, this book works as a diffraction grating, illuminating important material differences, relationalities, and entanglements in the lively dance of mattering. And it may be difficult to appreciate the intricacies of the patterns that is produced if significant segments of the book are skipped over. That said, it is undoubtedly the case that interesting patterns arise nonetheless in sampling different chapters, and different readers may find different samplings particularly worthwhile. Physicists and philosophers of science may be particularly interested in chapters 3, 4, and 7. These chapters, taken together, constitute a detailed examination of Bohr's philosophy physics and offer a coherent reconstruction of the interpretive issues together with an accessible and systematic presentation of some important experimental results from the past decade. Chapter 5 was originally published as a journal article, and I have retained its original structure so that it can continue to be usefully read as a separate standalone piece. Conversely, it could conceivably be skipped without losing the continuity of the argument, though surely risking some important insights. Chapter 4 is a key chapter, and in many respects, so is Chapter 7. This is where the notion of entanglement takes on important nuances, textures, and crucial non-colloquial meanings. Less scientifically inclined readers, or readers who may think of themselves as not very interested in the details of the philosophical issues in quantum physics, may be tempted to skip Chapter 7. I would like to encourage at least a cursory reading of this chapter, if only for its valuable insights into the nature of causality, identity, and nature. Unsuspecting readers may find themselves drawn in more than they would have thought. Post-structuralist scholars in particular, who are used to making their way through difficult and dense theoretical terrains, will not want to skip over the remarkable and radical reworking of some key concepts in their lexicon. Quantum leaps, in any case, are unavoidable. Whatever the nature of your entangled engagement, I hope you find it enjoyable and thought-provoking.